My name is Ire. I'm a front-end web developer and user interface designer, and I'm based in Lagos, Nigeria. This is actually my first time here in Sweden, and usually when I come to these conferences, I try and research something about the country, and usually I default to like maybe football, maybe Nigeria played Sweden, and I usually like make fun of the fact that we beat you guys, but unfortunately, you guys beat us, so I'm gonna skip the joke this time. So I also write a blog, which is called Bits of Code, and it's about front-end web development. I'm actually currently trying to blog almost every day, so there's a lot of content there now if you're interested. And also a Google expert in web technologies. So I'm talking about how to make web accessibility easy. And the first thing that you always need to ask yourself is, why is accessibility important? And I promise this isn't a trick question. Sometimes it seems as if you can't really question why you should make an accessible website. It just seems like, oh, you just have to do it by default, and maybe you're a bad person if you ever ask, wait, why do I actually have to do this? But I'm just going to go through a few reasons why accessible sites are important. And the number one reason I always start with is that accessible sites are great for just like everybody. So when you think about your users or your users of your website or your app or whatever it is, it's kind of easy to lump them into these two categories where you think about somebody being fully abled or fully disabled. And you may think that maybe like 99% of people are abled, and so why should I be making a site accessible for like the 1% of the population? But in actual fact, the graph of your users, this is actually very accurate. It looks something like this, where the people you might think of as fully abled are a small proportion of your users, and the people that you might think of as disabled are also like a small proportion. So it kind of leaves a huge amount of the graph that you're not really thinking about when you're trying to lump your users into abled or disabled. So what's this like big middle group? And here is what we would consider temporary and situational disabilities. So a temporary disability is, for example, if you like break your arm and you can't use it for a period of 3 months, you're sort of in the same situation as someone who maybe was born without an arm, but it's only for like a temporary period of time. And then situational disabilities are just situations or particular scenarios in which someone who is otherwise quote-unquote abled might function in a similar capacity to someone who is quote-unquote disabled. So just a couple of examples. So when you think about vision, you might have abled as somebody who can see perfectly, and then disabled as someone who might be 100% blind. And what we actually have is some other cases. So temporary disabled might be somebody like me. If I lose my glasses, I really can't see anything. So I'm actually like almost legally blind. So I would actually be functioning as someone who can't see for the period of time where I don't have my glasses. Then we have situational disabilities. So that could just be a case where you go to like a nightclub or something and you're not able to see as well as you would if it was like more better lit. Then we have hearing, so we have abled, someone who can hear perfectly, and disabled, maybe someone who's totally deaf. And then what we actually have is other scenarios. So like a temporary disability is if you have maybe like an ear infection or something, and you can't really hear for a period of time. And then a situation many of us has probably been in, if you're just sitting somewhere and you have headphones and you can't really hear what's going on around you. So all these cases that you might not be thinking about actually make up the larger proportion of people using your app. Because if you think about it, nobody is going to be 100% sitting and using their full vision to consume your application or your website. People are usually distracted. People might be carrying things, so only using your website or your app with like one hand. And so you're missing out on all these use cases of quote-unquote like normal or abled people by only trying to lump your users into the category of fully abled or fully disabled. So another reason that accessibility is important is the web by default is actually really accessible. And this, I guess, kind of blew my mind the first time I really, really thought about it. Because if you think about it, the most accessible type of website is something that kind of looks like this. And it's just plain text, and it just has almost nothing apart from the content. And the reason it's so accessible is because plain text is going to be the most malleable form of content, because it can be converted into anything. It can be converted into audio, it can be converted, it can be read aloud by a screen reader, or it can just be read in this format. And this is not to say that all our websites should look like this. This is just showing an extreme example and showing that anything we add to this is actually probably just going to make it worse. So we have to be very conscious about what we do add to the website. So that's why it's really important to, as much as possible, like, use the platform. So we have so many different elements that are provided to us to make our apps or our websites more accessible. And if we just use them, we wouldn't run into so many problems. So a typical example is if you want to have a button where if you click on it, it'll open something like a modal, for example. So if you were to just use the button element, you could do pretty much just this. And you get a lot for free by just using that particular element. So the element is focusable via the keyboard or a screen reader. It's clickable by a mouse, the enter key, or the space bar. It has an accessible name of state that is exposed to assistive technology. And when people click it, they expect there to be an interaction, as opposed to something like a link where you're expected to be navigated to somewhere else on the page. And finally, we also get a bunch of styles, which you probably might not want, but at least you know that if you just use the button element and you just plopped it on your page, everybody's going to understand this is a button and this is what it's going to do. However, if you decided to try and recreate this by using a div, which for some reason a lot of people like to do, you can start with this, but you're actually giving yourself a lot more work, because from the beginning, you have to actually add all of this just to get the same functionality that you would if you had just used a button. You have to make it focusable. You have to add the roles so assistive technology knows what it is. You have to handle both clicks and key presses. You have to do even more work to handle all the different types of interaction to make sure both the space or the enter key are allowed. And you have to add all the styles back to make it look like an actual button. And at the end of the day, it just seems like you just added more work, like you've just played yourself. You could have just used a simple button. So this is a wise person somewhere on Twitter I found said that HTML is by default very accessible, and it's our job as developers not to fuck that up. So the third reason, which is more of the moral reason you might hear about more, about why accessibility is important, is because the web is for everyone. So I tend to think of it in the same way that I think about architects that are building public spaces. The web is also like a public space. And if you saw stairs like this that didn't have the accessible entrance, that would kind of be unthinkable. It would probably be illegal in a lot of places. And so we try to think about the web in that similar way. Why should we be able to build websites that will just block off a huge section of the population from using it? And I found this article about the web accessibility laws in Sweden. And there's actually recently a new EU directive that's trying to make web accessibility more of a legal requirement. And just this quote where the author said that right now it's essentially that accessibility on the web is effectively the law in Sweden. And just to reiterate what I said before, this making websites more accessible is not just a win for people who need it because they have some form of disability, but it's actually just a win for everybody. So the final reason why accessibility is important is that it really doesn't have to be hard. And that's kind of what I'm going to try and cover as much as possible in this talk, that accessibility can be easy to do. Because as I showed before, the difference between making an accessible or an inaccessible site is usually, okay, yeah, it's usually just the difference between using the correct elements. So instead of using a div, you use a button. And that's not extra work, it's just doing the work in the right way. So how do we get started with accessibility? And like with anything, you kind of need to start from testing. You can't fail or pass an accessibility test if you never do one in the first place. So you need to start from knowing what is wrong or right with your site before you can move on with that. And the best place to start is this Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And it's basically like the Bible of accessibility on the web. It's a really, really long document, and it just outlines everything you need to know to make websites accessible. And it's kind of boiled down into these 4 concepts, so I'm just going to go over them real quick. So first is perceivable, and that is that information and UI components need to be presented in a way that users can perceive. So a great example is going back to what I said about about the most accessible format being text, because it can be used by many different people in many different ways. So whenever you have something on your site that isn't text, so for example, media like an image or audio or video, the best practice is to provide a text alternative as well. So this is a simple example of just using the alt tag on an image. But if you had like audio or video, you could also provide a transcript. Another example of that is setting good contrast ratio. So this is just to do with the color of the text as against the background and making sure that it has enough contrast so it's readable. And this is a great tool. I will upload my slides, so we'll have the links to everything. But this is a really great tool where you can just input the colors of your background and your text, and you can find out whether it is suitable to use. So the next guideline is about making sites operable. And this just says that UI components and navigation need to be operable. So a good example of this is making the navigation and everything keyboard accessible. So this is my blog, and this is just me using only the keyboard to navigate around the page. And what you can see is that the user can like navigate through things like the menu and not get trapped, not get their keyboard trapped rather within like certain elements. And also you can see that at any point that something is being highlighted, it is very clear what is being highlighted. So I know a lot of people like to remove the outline from elements because they don't like the blue thing, which is the same thing that I've done here. But the point is that you kind of need to replace it with something so that at any point, if a user is navigating with a keyboard, they can know what element they are being focused on at the moment. So next we have understandable, and this is that information and the operation of the UI needs to be understandable. So one very simple thing you can do with this is to just always specify the language of your document. So you can go really a long way with this, because if people are using things like assistive technology and you aren't specifying the language, it will just, the screen reader will just assume that the document is in whatever language the person's machine is in. So if I have time, I'm going to do like a demo and show how that would actually work. So another great tip is providing instructions whenever there is any form of interactivity. So a great example is when you're creating an account with Google or Gmail, and you're trying to type in your password, you're getting immediate feedback on anything that you're doing, so the user feels guided and understands everything they're doing as they're moving along. Then finally, we have robust. And this is just boils down to writing code that is valid and can be interpreted by the browser, by assistive technology, or any form of user agent. So it's just about making sure you have like the appropriate doc type, you have a language, as I mentioned, you have the correct character set and titles and things like that. And also really important is labeling elements. So wherever you have any kind of like input or a button, making sure it has an actual label. So even as you can see with the button, even if you want the button to just have like X or an emoji or something, also providing an accessible label via an attribute like ARIA label. So all of this is a lot. I'm not expecting anybody to read the entire document or memorize everything. I haven't read the entire document or memorized everything, so yes? Sorry, what? The documents? Yeah, yeah. um, yeah, it has many different things. This was just like a very short summary, but it does take into account things like, so that's actually a really good example, which I think I used to have a slide about that, but I removed it. But so a good example is not conveying things only via color. So a lot of people tend to do things like, I don't know if I have it here, but like green for something that is good and you passed, or red for something that's bad and you need to go and fix. But doing that alone obviously alienates, or it doesn't convey that same information to people who can't perceive those colors. So also doing things like adding a check mark or a cross or something in addition to the color is going to be more useful. So yeah, I was just saying you don't have to memorize the whole thing. You don't even have to know all the rules. You just have to use good tools. So I'm going to talk about a few tools that you can make use of to audit your site. So the first one is Lighthouse, and this is already inbuilt into Chrome. So all you have to do is open your Chrome DevTools, and you can perform an audit. So this is an example. It has like many different audits, but you can select just accessibility if that's what you want to worry about, and it will analyze the page, and it will come up with a list of things that you need to fix or things that you've also passed, so you also get a nice score to see if you're doing well or not. This was a while ago, so I need to update to make sure it's still like good. So this is kind of an example of what you would get. And that's really good for if you're just kind of getting started and you just want to have like a quick I want to know what is right or wrong with my site. Something that's a bit more extensive is called Pally. And they actually have a bunch of different projects all related to accessibility and accessibility tools. But I'm going to talk about two of them. So the first enables you to do kind of just on-the-fly usability testing. And it's kind of similar to Lighthouse, but in my experience is a lot more extensive. So all you have to do is install it. It's a command line tool. And then you just run Pally and then whatever web page you want to do. So here's an example. Hopefully you can kind of make it out. But so basically I've just run Pally against the homepage of my blog. And at the bottom, what you can see is you get a summary of all the errors, warnings, and notices. So they rank all the feedback that you get. So obviously errors are things you should go and fix right now, whereas notices are things, okay, if you have time, you can go and have a look at them. So an example of a notice is just, okay, make sure that the title element describes the page. And that's not something Pally can determine for you. So it's more just like, have a look at this and see if it makes sense. Then you have stuff like warnings. So this is to do with contrast ratio. I need to go and check to see, make sure that there's good contrast on that element. Then we have errors. So these are more critical things that, yeah, I need to definitely go and fix. So for example, there's no label for this form field. So that's obviously really important, and you need to go and fix it as soon as possible. And that's a bit manual, having to type in Pally and each particular URL you want to do. So they also have a continuous integration tool. And I mean, this is how CI works. I'm sure you already know, but I just like to draw diagrams. So obviously, Pally is going to go where the test is, and you can either pass or fail the deploy of your application based on how the accessibility tests fare. So again, all you do is install it, and what is a bit different about the CI tool is that you have a dedicated file, and you can specify exactly how you want the audit to go. So you can specify a list of URLs, so it's not just one anymore. You can even add a sitemap, I think, so you can go crawl through your entire site, and you can also have more specific. Configurations. So for example, the screen reader only class, I don't want to be concerned about that because it's probably going to pull up a contrast ratio warning. But I know that, but I don't need to have that warning because this is only for screen readers. So you can do things like that. You can even go really, really granular and say you don't want to have any warnings from specific guidelines within the web content accessibility guidelines. So it's very, very granular. And what's really, really cool is that you can even set actions for it to do. So you can say that you want Pally to go and attempt to fill out this form, and then it can tell you whether a user would be able to properly fill it out using a screen reader or whatever like that. Then you just run Pally CI. And one thing I want to mention, which is really helpful when you're just kind of getting started, is maybe you don't want your build to fail if you have I don't know, a few errors. So you can start by adding this threshold flag, and you can set that it should only fail if there's more than 50 errors. And that's kind of a good way to start because you can start with that and then you can reduce it as you go. So it's not like you have to be perfect from day one. You can just kind of granularly get into it. I also wrote an article about how you can use Pally in case you're interested in that. So next is user research, which I'm sure we all know is important, but it's even more important for testing the usability of your sites. And this is a really great YouTube video, which it's kind of short, but it just outlines the value of and how to do proper usability testing. But obviously, it's not so easy to do user testing at all, and even considering user testing for people who might have disabilities or whatever it is. So I always recommend, and this is what I personally do, to just test it yourself as much as possible. So one thing you can definitely do is kind of throw away your mouse for maybe a day and experience the web with only a keyboard, and you'll be surprised at how many sites completely break when you're just trying to navigate with a keyboard, and then you can kind of get to see the importance of it. Another great thing is to try a screen reader. Out of curiosity, has anyone here used a screen reader before? Okay, a few people, yeah. Well, I want to actually show how it works. So yeah, one thing to note is if you have a Mac, it's already it's inbuilt into the computer. I think it's also the same in Windows, Microsoft now, but I'm not 100% sure. But there's also this Chromebook screen reader. So it's a Chrome extension, and you can add it to the Chrome browser, and you can experience a very light version of a screen reader. So if you don't want to do the full experience, you can just, if you only want to test maybe your specific site, you can just turn it on and use it for that site and turn it off, and it's not going to mess up everything on your machine. So now I want to do a very quick demo of how a screen reader works. Okay, let's see if this is going to work. Okay, so, okay, this is going to be difficult. Yeah, so I think I'm clicking the right one. All right. Oh, 1 second. Oh, 4,000. Okay, great. So this is the Ghost homepage, and by default, they don't actually specify a lang attribute. And this is like the French version, of course. I tried to do a Swedish version, but it wasn't really working, so sorry. So I just want to show you what it kind of sounds like when you're navigating through the page, and specifically a page that is not in the language of my machine, because my machine is in English. So,
welcome to VoiceOver. VoiceOver speaks descriptions of items on the screen and can be...
Sorry.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Ghost, la plateforme de publication professionnelle. Google Chrome. Window. Ghost, la plateforme de publication professionnelle. Web content as keyboard focus.
Okay.
You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow.
Okay. So, as you heard, it kind of just describes what's going on. And because this is system-wide, it's telling me what window I'm in. So I'm obviously in Chrome and what the title is and everything. And then you can navigate through the pages. So you can go through. You can like
Visited link.
Through.
Cell answer. Main. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Control, Option, Space.
Yeah, so what I specifically wanted you to hear was how it was pronouncing.
Zoom in, zoom in. Chrome has new window.
Yeah.
Visited link. And Savoir Plus.
So
you are currently on a link.
Yeah.
To click this link, press Control, Option, Space. VoiceOver off.
Okay. So you can hear that it's said that, I can't even do a French accent, but it said that in an English accent, and it was attempting to say a French word. So that's what will happen if you go onto a page like this that's clearly in French, but the document doesn't specify that it's in French. So the screen reader will just read it like it's English, and it can be confusing like that. So what I wanted to show was, this is an example of when I did put the lang attribute. Okay, let's try this again.
Welcome to VoiceOver. VoiceOver speaks descriptions of items on the screen. VoiceOver on Chrome. Go. Visited link.
Se lancer.
Main.
So yeah,
you
can
are
see
currently
the
on a
difference.
link.
Okay,
to click this link, press VoiceOver off.
Okay. So I hope you could actually hear the difference. One was clearly in French because it understood that this was a word that was in French. And that's just one example of how you like write your documents can impact what a person using assistive technology would see. So let's see if I can. Okay, bring this back. Okay, so finally, how do we make web accessibility easy? So unfortunately, it's not as simple as just pressing a button and everything becomes accessible. If it was, that would be amazing, but unfortunately it isn't. The real reason is to make accessibility a first-class citizen within your organization and make it as important as other things like performance or design or anything else like that. And what's also really important is making accessibility everybody's job, so not just the front-end developer. I just saw this tweet today, which I thought was really like apt, that you don't want to be the one person who's caring about accessibility in your organization. It kind of needs to be something that everybody is thinking about and everybody cares about. So I really like this document on the accessibility guidelines that the Vox Media Network follows. And they have like this huge document and this checklist that outlines a bunch of different things that all the different people in the organization need to think about when they're thinking about accessibility. So designers, for example, need to think about colors and contrast. And then you have the front-end developers who are thinking about how they're building the site. So like I said, making sure you have the correct attributes, labels, things like that. Then you have like project managers. Then you have quality assurance, you have editorial. So basically just everybody in the organization has a specific job to do when it comes to accessibility. It's not something that nobody thinks about, and then at the end of the day, the front-end developer needs to just all of a sudden make everything accessible. So the real trick here is that accessibility is only going to be difficult if you think about and do it last. If you build your whole site and then at the end think, okay, now how do we make this accessible? then you're just kind of like having to overhaul everything. It's so much more difficult to write everything, all your buttons as divs, and then have to go back and then make them buttons again, than to just start by writing them as actual buttons. And finally, I just want to leave you with this quote, which has personally been like important to me because it has made me feel like I don't need to be 100% perfect in everything I do. I'm sure if you go to my blog or some of my websites, there will be some accessibility errors. But the important thing is that it doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to be you just have to keep trying to make an improvement. And if all you do is go back and add like a lang attribute to your HTML, you can like feel good about that and know that you're actually making an improvement that people who are using assistive technology, or like I said, people who may have temporary or situational disabilities, you're making an impact for them because you're still making something that little bit better. So thank you.